June 8th, 793 AD, the monks at Lindisfarne Monastery saw the ships approaching. Long, sleek vessels with dragon heads carved into their prows. They thought perhaps they were traders. They were wrong. What happened in the next few hours would shock all of Christian Europe and mark the beginning of the Viking Age. But the monks weren't the only victims that day. Hidden in the monastery were nuns, women who'd devoted their lives to God, who believed their holy vows would protect them. They were wrong too. What the Vikings did to these women was so horrific that medieval chroniclers could barely write about it. And Lindisfarne was just the beginning. For the next 200 years, Viking raiders would target monasteries and convents across Europe. And the Christian nuns inside faced a fate that was quite literally worse than death. Before we dive into the horror, you need to understand who these nuns were and why Vikings targeted them specifically. Because this wasn't random violence. This was calculated, strategic brutality. In medieval Europe, monasteries and convents were more than just religious sites. They were repositories of wealth. Gold chalices, silver candlesticks, jeweled crosses, illuminated manuscripts worth fortunes. The church had spent centuries accumulating treasure, and much of it was stored in these isolated religious communities. But here's the thing that made them perfect targets. They were defenseless. Monks and nuns had taken vows of peace. They had no weapons, no military training, no soldiers to protect them. They relied entirely on the sanctity of their religious status for protection. In Christian Europe, attacking a monastery was considered one of the worst sins imaginable. You'd be excommunicated, damned to hell for eternity. The Vikings didn't care. They were pagans. Christian threats of hellfire meant nothing to them. They saw monasteries and convents the way a wolf sees a pen full of sheep. Easy prey, rich rewards, no consequences they believed in. Nuns were particularly vulnerable. In this era, women entered convents for many reasons. Some had genuine religious callings. Others were sent there by families who couldn't afford dowries for marriage. Some were widows seeking protection. Some were noble women who'd chosen religious life over political marriages, regardless of why they were there. They all shared one thing. They believed the walls of their convent and their holy vows would keep them safe. They were devastatingly wrong. Let me walk you through what actually happened during a typical Viking raid on a convent. And I warn you, this is going to be disturbing. The Vikings would arrive without warning, usually at dawn or dusk when visibility was poor. Their longships could navigate shallow rivers and beach directly on shore, allowing them to strike deep inland with incredible speed. By the time anyone realized they were under attack, it was too late to escape. The raiders would surround the convent, cutting off all exits. Then they'd smash through the gates or scale the walls. These men were professional warriors, many of them huge by medieval standards, covered in scars, wielding axes and swords. Imagine being a nun, someone who'd never seen violence, suddenly confronted with a gang of massive, screaming warriors breaking into your home. The first priority was always the treasure. Vikings would tear apart churches and convents looking for gold and silver. They'd rip crosses off walls, smash open reliquaries containing holy relics, stuff chalices and candlesticks into sacks. Anything of value was taken. What couldn't be carried was often destroyed out of sheer contempt for the Christian faith. But the treasure wasn't the only thing Vikings took from convents. They took the nuns themselves. Here's what medieval sources tell us, and what they're often too horrified to describe in detail. Viking raiders viewed Christian nuns as particularly desirable captives for several twisted reasons. First, these women were often young. Many entered convents in their teens. Second, they were from relatively wealthy families, which meant potential ransom money. Third, and this is the darkest part, Vikings found a perverse entertainment in violating women who'd taken vows of chastity. It was a way of mocking the Christian God, of proving that their pagan gods were stronger. Contemporary accounts from the early medieval period described Viking raiders assaulting nuns inside the very churches where they devoted themselves to God, on altars, in front of holy icons. While other Vikings looted, some would drag nuns into side chambers, or even commit their atrocities in full view of other captives. The psychological cruelty was as deliberate as the physical violence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our primary sources for this period, describes how Vikings would defile nuns before either killing them or taking them as slaves. The chroniclers, who were monks and deeply religious men, struggled to find words to describe what they'd witnessed or heard about. They used euphemisms like subjected to heathen lust or suffered violations too terrible to name. But we can read between the lines. We know what they meant, and it was exactly as horrific as you're imagining. After the initial assault, Vikings faced a decision about what to do with surviving nuns. They had three main options, and all of them were terrible. Option 1. Kill them. This was often viewed as the most merciful fate. A quick death was better than what came next. Some nuns were killed during the raid itself, either because they tried to resist or simply because the Vikings felt like it. Others were killed afterward to send a message, their bodies left displayed as warnings to other Christian communities. Option 2. Ransom them. If a nun came from a wealthy family, Vikings might try to extract ransom money. The nun would be held captive, often in terrible conditions, while messages were sent to her family demanding payment. If the family could pay, she might be released. If they couldn't, or if the negotiations took too long, the nun would either be sold into slavery or killed. But here's the cruel reality. Even if a nun was ransomed and returned to her family, her life was effectively over. Medieval Christian society had zero tolerance for women who'd been violated, even if it was through no fault of their own. These women were considered ruined and polluted. They couldn't marry. They often couldn't return to their convents. Many were shunned by their own families, blamed for their own victimization. Some took their own lives rather than face the shame and isolation. Option 3. Slavery. This was perhaps the worst fate of all. And this is where the true horror of Viking brutality becomes clear. Nuns who were taken as slaves faced a nightmare that could last years or even decades. Let me explain the Viking slave system and what it meant for these women. Vikings called slaves thralls. The thrall system was fundamental to Viking society. Estimates suggest that up to 10% of the population in Scandinavia during the Viking Age were slaves. These weren't just prisoners of war. They were people captured during raids, just like the Christian nuns were discussing. Female thralls, especially young, attractive women, were among the most valuable. They served multiple purposes: domestic labor, agricultural work, and sexual exploitation. A nun taken as a thrall would be transported back to Scandinavia, often a journey of weeks by sea in horrific conditions. Many didn't survive the voyage. Those who did arrived in a completely alien world. They didn't speak the language. They didn't understand the customs. They had no legal rights whatsoever. They were property. Vikings could do literally anything they wanted to their thralls without consequence. Here's a specific detail that shows just how dehumanizing this system was. Thralls weren't allowed to grow their hair long. It was kept short as a mark of their slave status. For medieval women, especially nuns who often had their hair covered but not cut, this was another layer of humiliation. Their very appearance advertised their degradation. Female Christian thralls often became concubines for their Viking owners. They had no choice in the matter. They could be passed around, shared, or sold to other Vikings. If they became pregnant, their children would be born into slavery. There was no escape, no hope, no future except continued servitude. And here's something particularly cruel. Vikings often gave their Christian thralls demeaning names related to their former religious life. Names that mocked their faith and their violated vows. Every time someone called them by these names, it was a reminder of everything they'd lost. Some historical accounts describe Christian thrall women being forced to participate in pagan religious ceremonies. They'd be made to honor Norse gods, to participate in rituals that directly contradicted everything they'd devoted their lives to. This spiritual torture was deliberate. Vikings understood that for these deeply religious women, being forced to renounce their faith was another form of violation. Now let me tell you about some specific historical incidents that demonstrate just how systematic and brutal. This treatment was in 794 AD. Just 1 year after Lindisfarne, Vikings raided the monastery at Jarrow in Northumbria. Among the victims were several nuns from a nearby convent who'd sought shelter there. The raid was so violent that it became legendary even by Viking standards. Contemporary accounts describe how the Vikings showed particular cruelty to the religious women, singling them out for the worst treatment as a way of demonstrating their contempt for Christianity. In 795 AD, Vikings hit Iona, one of the most sacred sites in Celtic Christianity. The monastery there housed both monks and nuns. The Vikings came back multiple times over the following decades, each raid more brutal than the last. By 86 AD, they'd killed 68 members of the community in a single raid. The survivors, including nuns, were either killed or enslaved. The monastery was eventually abandoned because it was simply too dangerous to stay there. In 820s and 830s, Viking raids intensified across Ireland. Irish annals from this period are filled with references to convents being attacked and nuns being carried off by heathens. One entry from 824 describes how Vikings raided a convent, took all the nuns as slaves, and burned the buildings. Another from 836 describes Vikings specifically targeting a convent known for housing daughters of Irish nobility, clearly viewing them as valuable ransom opportunities. The raids on Francia, modern-day France and Germany, were even more systematic. Vikings discovered that Frankish convents were particularly wealthy and well-stocked with both treasure and valuable captives. Between 830 and 850 AD, dozens of convents along the Seine-Loire and Rhine rivers were raided repeatedly. Here's a specific example that shows the calculated nature of these attacks. In 841 AD, Vikings raided Rouen and specifically targeted the convent of Saint Win. They knew exactly what they were looking for. They captured the abbess, a noblewoman named Hildward, along with all the nuns under her care. They demanded massive ransoms. Some families paid. Others couldn't. Those who couldn't were sold into slavery and never heard from again. The psychological impact of these raids on Christian Europe cannot be overstated. People lived in constant terror. Coastal communities and river settlements were essentially under siege for decades. The phrase "a furor normanorum libera nos" Domini became a common prayer. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. But prayers didn't stop the Vikings. Nothing stopped them until Christian kingdoms finally organized effective defenses, which took generations. Now let's talk about something that historians debate but evidence strongly suggests: the possibility that some nuns died by their own hand rather than face capture. There are accounts difficult to verify but disturbingly consistent across different sources, of nuns mutilating themselves when Viking raids were imminent. Some allegedly cut off their own noses and lips, deliberately making themselves ugly so Vikings wouldn't want them as slaves or concubines. The most famous alleged incident involves Saint Iba the Younger and her convent in Scotland. When Vikings were approaching in 878 AD, Iba supposedly gathered all the nuns and urged them to disfigure themselves. She cut off her own nose and upper lip. The other nuns followed her example. The theory was that Vikings, seeing these horrifically disfigured women, would leave them alone. According to legend, the Vikings were so enraged by this that they burned the entire convent with all the nuns inside. Whether this story is true or not, the fact that it was told and believed shows how desperate the situation was. Women believed that deliberately disfiguring themselves was preferable to what Vikings would do to them. Think about that level of terror. Other accounts describe nuns taking poison when raids were imminent, or throwing themselves from walls, or drowning themselves in wells. These stories might be exaggerated or invented by later chroniclers, but they reflect a reality. Capture by Vikings was considered a fate worse than death, and some women chose death on their own terms rather than face that fate. Let me tell you about the long-term impact on the women who survived and were eventually freed or ransomed, because their suffering didn't end when the Vikings let them go. Medieval Christian society was brutal to women who'd been sexually violated. Even though everyone knew these women were innocent victims of pagan violence, they were still considered tainted. Church doctrine struggled with how to handle these situations. Some bishops argued that nuns who'd been violated couldn't return to religious life. Others said they could, but should do severe penance as if they'd sinned. Imagine surviving months or years of enslavement, finally being freed, and then being told by your own church that you need to repent for what was done to you against your will. The injustice is staggering. Many of these women ended up in a terrible limbo, too polluted for convent life, but unmarriageable in secular society. They often lived as outcasts, dependent on charity, carrying the shame of their victimization for the rest of their lives. Some committed suicide after being freed. The historical record mentions women who died of sorrow, or women who refused food and wasted away after returning from Viking captivity. These were likely women who couldn't cope with the trauma and the social rejection. A few found refuge in convents that were more compassionate, houses that accepted them back and tried to help them heal. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Now let's address the question that might be bothering you. Is any of this exaggerated? Were Vikings really this brutal, or are Christian chroniclers making them look worse than they were? The honest answer is probably both. Christian sources definitely emphasized Viking brutality to paint them as enemies of God and civilization. Some accounts were likely exaggerated for propagandistic purposes. Chroniclers wanted to shock their readers and motivate resistance against the raiders. But archaeology and comparative evidence from other sources, including Norse sagas and even Islamic accounts of Vikings, confirm the basic pattern. Vikings were brutal. They did target religious sites. They did take slaves, including women, on a massive scale. The slave trade was a fundamental part of Viking economy. Norse sagas, written by Vikings themselves, casually mention taking women as war booty. They describe slave markets in Scandinavia and trading posts where Christian captives were bought and sold. These weren't seen as shameful acts in pagan Viking culture. They were seen as normal consequences of successful raids. So while specific details might be exaggerated, the overall picture is accurate. Christian nuns were targeted, captured, violated, enslaved, and traumatized on a massive scale during the Viking Age. Here's something else worth considering. We only know about the cases that were recorded. Chroniclers wrote about famous monasteries and convents, places that were important enough to mention. But there were countless smaller religious houses that were raided and destroyed without anyone writing about it. How many nuns suffered and died without their stories ever being recorded? We'll never know, but the number is certainly higher than what appears in our historical sources. Let me tell you about how this systematic violence eventually helped end the Viking Age, because there's a bitter irony in how the story concludes. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, Christian kingdoms had finally organized effective responses to Viking raids. They built fortified towns, established standing armies, and created rapid response forces. Monasteries and convents were either fortified or relocated to safer areas. The easy pickings were over. At the same time, Vikings began settling in the territories they'd raided. The Viking settlers in England, Ireland, and Francia started converting to Christianity. Within a generation or two, the descendants of the raiders were practicing the same religion their ancestors had mocked. And here's the irony. As Vikings converted to Christianity, they adopted Christian views about monasteries and nuns. The great-grandsons of men who'd raided convents were now founding and funding convents themselves. The cycle of violence ended not through military defeat, but through cultural assimilation. But that didn't undo the damage. 2 centuries of terror had devastated monastic culture in many regions. Libraries had been burned. Illuminated manuscripts had been destroyed or lost. Entire traditions of learning had been interrupted. The cultural loss was immense, and the individual human cost? Incalculable. Thousands of nuns, each one a person with hopes and dreams and faith, had their lives destroyed. Most died without anyone remembering their names or their stories. So what lessons can we draw from this dark chapter of history? First, it's a reminder that religious devotion doesn't protect you from violence. These women believed their faith and their vows would keep them safe. They were wrong. Predators don't care about your beliefs or your innocence. Second, it shows how victim blaming is an ancient evil. Even in the medieval period, even when everyone knew these women were innocent victims, society still found ways to shame and punish them for what had been done to them. That pattern continues today. Third, it demonstrates how normal people can commit atrocities when their culture tells them it's acceptable. Vikings weren't monsters. They were humans like us. But their culture said raiding and enslaving Christians was fine, even praiseworthy. So they did it without guilt. Culture shapes behavior in powerful and sometimes horrifying ways. And finally, these stories remind us that history is full of suffering that goes unrecorded and unremembered. For every nun whose story made it into a chronicle, dozens more suffered in silence and died forgotten. We owe it to them to remember that they existed even if we don't know their names. The Viking raids on Christian convents represent one of the darkest periods in medieval European history. For over 200 years, women who devoted their lives to peace and prayer lived in terror of longships on the horizon. Many died. Many more wished they had. When we talk about the Viking Age today, we often focus on the exciting parts. The exploration, the craftsmanship, the mythology, the warrior culture, and those things were real. But so was this. The systematic targeting and brutalization of defenseless religious women was also part of Viking culture. We can't honestly remember the glory without also remembering the horror. What Vikings did to Christian nuns was worse than death because death is final. What these women experienced lasted, often for years, and changed them forever in ways that death doesn't. Those who survived carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. And medieval society gave them no help, no compassion, only judgment and shame. This is the truth that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe. This is the reality behind the euphemisms and the vague language. This is what happened when raiders with no regard for Christian morality encountered women who had no way to defend themselves. It was systematic. It was brutal. And it lasted for generations. That's the real history of Viking raids on Christian convents. Not an adventure story. Not a tale of clash of cultures. But a story of sustained violence against the most vulnerable and the lifelong trauma that violence created. Now you know the truth. And the truth, as dark as it is, deserves to be remembered.